I never planned to put this into words. In my line of work, memory is something you control, not something you share. You learn early that some things are better kept unexamined, not because they are classified, but because they interfere with function. You compartmentalize, you file, you move on. Most operations let you do that. They end clean. This one didn't. On September 14th, 2007, my platoon conducted a night raid on a confirmed target compound in eastern Afghanistan. That is the version that exists in the system. A lawful operation, a verified objective, no friendly casualties, limited resistance, materials collected, mission complete. If you pull the records, that's what you'll see. What you won't see is why I still remember the interior dimensions of a room that should not have fit inside the building that contained it. At the time, I was a squad leader in 2nd Platoon. We had been rotating through the same valleys long enough that terrain started to feel familiar in a way that was dangerous. You learn the shapes of ridgelines. You learn which compounds are always dark, which ones run generators at night, which ones keep dogs. The target that night was a facilitator, a man who moved people and supplies across districts. Not a high-value individual, not a headline, just another node. We had imagery, a layout drawn from overhead collection and a source walk. Thick mud walls, one main structure, a small courtyard, one outbuilding. Simple. The kind of place you clear in minutes and forget by morning. Insertion was uneventful. The helicopters dropped us where they were supposed to and left. We breached the outer wall and flowed into the compound without resistance. Standard movement, standard noise discipline. The night swallowed us the way it always does. Inside the main structure, something was off immediately. Not enough to stop us, just enough to register. Sound didn't behave the way it should have. Footsteps felt muted. Voices on the radio sounded flatter than usual, like they were being absorbed instead of reflected. I remember thinking the building felt padded, like insulation had been stuffed into the walls. We cleared the ground floor in under a minute. 2 adult males were killed resisting entry. 1 detainee was secured. Women and children were moved to a side room. The target was not present. That was not unusual. Our task shifted to exploitation. The stairwell to the 2nd floor was narrow and concrete, cold to the touch. At the top was a short hallway draped with fabric hangings. The patterns were geometric, repeating in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and another began. Under night vision, the designs seemed to vibrate slightly, though I later convinced myself that was just the grain of the image intensifier. The first 2 rooms were empty. Storage, bedding, nothing of interest. The 3rd door at the end of the hall was unmarked. Our intel packet showed a room there, a small one, a workspace. The door was unlocked. When it opened, the first thing that registered was depth. The room extended farther than it should have. Not by inches, by several meters. Enough that my internal map failed. Enough that my brain stalled, trying to reconcile what my eyes were seeing with what it knew the exterior of the building allowed. The ceiling was higher than expected. Not dramatically so, but enough that it created a vertical pressure you could feel. The air was still. Dust hung suspended in our infrared beams as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Along both walls were metal filing cabinets, old, surplus models, American, 7 of them. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden desk. Papers were spread across it, held down by stones. Smooth, river-worn stones. Not weights, not decorative objects. Stones arranged deliberately. I remember counting them without meaning to. 7, My point man opened the first filing cabinet. The sound of the drawer sliding out felt too loud in that room. Inside were folders, hundreds of them, neatly labeled. The labels were in English. Dates, locations, names. Some of the dates predated the war. Some predated the target's birth. Others had not happened yet. I didn't process that immediately. The mind resists information that has nowhere to go. I focused on procedure. Photograph in place. Bag and tag. Sample from each drawer. As we worked, the sense of pressure increased. Not fear. Not threat. Awareness. The feeling that the room was registering our presence in a way I had never experienced before or since. The walls were painted, but the texture was uneven, as if something had been sealed beneath the surface. The patterns on the hallway hangings matched the arrangement of the stones on the desk closely enough that it felt intentional. We were burning time. The clock mattered. External security was holding, but not indefinitely. We collected what we could carry and left the room intact. At no point did anything move on its own. Nothing appeared. No sound announced itself. But when I crossed the threshold to leave, I had the distinct impression that the space behind me was not empty. Back at the forward operating base, the debrief was routine. Photographs were turned over. Materials were logged. Certain details were redirected, not aggressively, but firmly. I was told to focus on actions, not impressions. Dimensions were not discussed. Within 48 hours, I was instructed not to describe the room beyond second floor office. That instruction was never written down, and that was when I understood that whatever we had found was not supposed to exist in any report. For the next several weeks, nothing happened. That's usually how these things go. You expect consequences to arrive immediately, dramatic and obvious, but they don't. They come later, quietly, embedded in routine. Orders still came in. Patrol schedules rotated. Intelligence briefs followed the same structure they always had. On paper, the operation faded into the background like hundreds before it, but something had shifted. I noticed it first during after-action reviews. Not what was said, but what wasn't. The room on the second floor never came up unless I brought it up, and when I did, the discussion moved away from it with practiced ease. Not panic, not alarm, familiarity. As if the omission itself was part of a template I hadn't been shown. One of the analysts asked me to clarify the sequence of movement through the building. I gave him the order, exactly as it happened. Ground floor, stairwell, second floor hallway, third door. Office, he said, typing without looking up. Yes, I replied, though the word felt inaccurate. He didn't ask anything else about it. 2 days later, a civilian I didn't recognize asked for my photographs. Not the full set. Specific frames, close-ups of the desk, the filing cabinets, the walls. He didn't introduce himself beyond a first name. No agency, no unit patch. He spoke calmly, like someone ordering equipment, not evidence. When I asked where the originals were going, he said, "They're being routed." That was it. I never saw those images again. The patrols resumed. We moved valleys, new terrain, different compounds. The work did what work always does. It filled the space where thinking might otherwise happen. But the room stayed with me. Not as a memory of fear, but as a problem that wouldn't resolve. I started checking structures more carefully after that. Counting steps, estimating distances, comparing interiors to exteriors in my head. It became a habit, one I didn't share. Most buildings matched. A few didn't quite, but those discrepancies were small. Construction irregularities, human error. Nothing like that room. About a month later, during a joint briefing, I recognized one of the dates. It was on a slide that had nothing to do with our area of operations. A regional update from another task force, a minor incident, an equipment failure at a logistics hub in Eastern Europe. No casualties, no media coverage, the kind of thing that gets buried in annexes. The date matched one I remembered seeing on a folder label. I didn't react. I didn't write it down. Memory does strange things when you don't invite it. I told myself I was mistaken, that I had misread it, that stress does that to people. 2 weeks later, another one happened. Different location, different unit, same pattern. That's when I stopped telling myself it was coincidence. I went back to my notes from the raid. Not official notes. The ones you keep for yourself. The ones that never leave your gear. I had sketched the room layout instinctively that night, a habit from earlier deployments. The proportions didn't make sense on paper any more than they had in person. I remembered the filing cabinets most clearly. 7 of them. Identical. American manufacture. The kind you'd see in an administrative office stateside, not in a remote compound halfway across the world. Why were they there? Why weren't they locked? And why were the labels in English? I didn't raise these questions. I didn't send emails. I didn't ask for clarification. You learn quickly which questions don't get answered and which ones get you removed from rotation. Instead, I watched. During another operation months later, I caught myself scanning walls for patterns, for uneven plaster, for signs of something buried beneath paint. I never found anything. Not really. But the instinct stayed. Then the reassignment orders came. No explanation, no disciplinary language. A lateral move. Same rank. Same responsibilities. Different command. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, it felt like distance being created. The new unit didn't have access to the same intelligence streams. Different compartment, different flow. I stopped seeing the updates that had lined up with the dates. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you don't need confirmation anymore. You know the shape of the absence. Years later, after I left active duty, I tried to locate records of the operation. Not through secure systems, through public acknowledgements, architectural surveys, anything that might corroborate what I remembered. The compound had been destroyed. Official measurements of the structure existed. They showed a second-floor office at the end of a hallway, 12 by 14 feet, exactly as it should have been. According to every record that mattered, the room I had stood in had never existed at all. And that's when I understood something else. We hadn't found an anomaly. We had entered a space that was not meant to persist once observed. After the record stopped agreeing with my memory, I stopped looking for confirmation. That was the mistake most people made. They assumed proof would come from documents, photographs, or official acknowledgement. But whatever we had encountered did not leave evidence in places designed to preserve it. It left effects. The first effect was procedural. I noticed it while working contract security 2 years later, embedded briefly with a task force that had nothing to do with counter-terrorism. Different mission set, different continent, different command structure. Yet the briefing language felt familiar in an uncomfortable way. Certain phrases were reused verbatim, not doctrinal terms, but framing language, the kind that shapes how a problem is understood before it's even described. There was a slide labeled continuity risk. No explanation followed it. Everyone in the room nodded as if they already understood. When I asked what it referred to, the officer running the brief said, "Legacy exposure," and moved on. No one challenged it. No one asked for elaboration. The phrase functioned like a sealed door. Mentioned, acknowledged, not opened. That night I lay awake thinking about the word. Continuity, not continuation, not projection. Continuity implied something unbroken, something that persisted regardless of oversight, leadership changes, or operational failure. Something that did not reset. I started paying attention to patterns instead of events. Events were noisy. Patterns were quiet. Patterns required patience. Across different theatres and agencies, I began noticing the same architectural anomalies, not dramatic ones, small inconsistencies, interior corridors that seemed longer than exterior measurements allowed, rooms that felt acoustically dead in ways that didn't match surrounding spaces, offices where radio interference behaved oddly, cutting out for seconds at a time with no clear cause. Always temporary, always deniable, always written off as construction quirks or equipment malfunction, and always followed by renovations. Walls repainted, layouts adjusted, access restricted. The spaces corrected themselves. I realized then that the room in Abbottabad hadn't been unique. It had simply been exposed long enough for us to recognize it as wrong. Most of the others never were. I reached out once to someone who had been on the raid, someone I trusted to tell me the truth, even if it cost him something. We hadn't spoken in years. The conversation started with normal things: family, work, time passing. Then I asked him if he ever thought about that second-floor room. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he said, "I don't remember a room." His voice was steady, too steady. I didn't push. A few days later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, no greeting, just a sentence. Some structures are observational, not spatial. That was it. I never replied. The sentence stayed with me because it explained more than it should have. If the room wasn't defined by space, then measurements didn't matter. Exterior walls were irrelevant. It existed as long as it was being used, observed, or referenced. When that stopped, it collapsed back into compliance with reality. That explained the filing cabinets, the dates, the absence. I began to wonder who maintained such places. Not built them, maintained them. Who decided when a space was needed, when it was safe to let it persist, and when it had to be erased without leaving residue. I also began to wonder why that compound had been allowed to hold one for so long. The answer came slowly. Bin Laden wasn't hiding there. He was anchoring it. The realization was not comforting. It reframed everything. The security, the isolation, the strange garden geometry, the lack of digital connectivity. The room didn't exist because of him. He existed there because of the room, or because of what passed through it. Years later, when the final date passed, the one I had memorized without meaning to, I was no longer surprised. The event itself was insignificant, a controlled incident, contained, classified, forgotten. What mattered was that nothing followed. No escalation, no revelation, just silence. That's when I understood the most dangerous part. Whatever system had produced those files did not require success to continue. It adapted. It absorbed outcomes and adjusted its projections. It did not care whether we noticed or not. The room had been a node, and nodes could be replaced. The longer I stayed away from formal operations, the more clearly the pattern emerged. Distance helped. Without daily briefings and command noise, the signal became easier to isolate. It wasn't about specific missions or locations. It was about how information was being handled before it ever became actionable. I noticed it while consulting on a private security audit for a technology firm. The work had nothing to do with military operations, infrastructure, access control, risk mitigation, clean civilian language. But buried in the documentation was a familiar structure, a section outlining pre-event alignment, not contingency planning, not forecasting, alignment. The language was precise. It described adjustments made in advance of incidents that had not yet occurred, justified by pattern convergence. No dates, no predictions. Just quiet preparation for outcomes treated as statistically inevitable. When I asked where the model came from, the project lead shrugged. "Inherited framework," he said. "Been around longer than anyone here." I didn't ask again. What struck me wasn't that such models existed. That was expected. Intelligence agencies had been running predictive analysis for decades. What struck me was how confident the framework was without showing its work. It didn't explain why something would happen. It simply assumed that it would. That confidence felt familiar. I began to realize that the files we found hadn't been predictions in the traditional sense. They weren't forecasts or probabilities. They were confirmations recorded ahead of time, documentation of outcomes already accounted for. The room wasn't showing the future. It was synchronizing with it. Once I framed it that way, other details snapped into place. The lack of security on the filing cabinets, the absence of encryption, the English labels. Those files weren't meant to be protected from discovery. They were meant to be accessed by anyone who knew what they were looking at. They weren't secrets. They were reference points. I started to suspect that the true value of the room wasn't in the information it stored, but in the act of storage itself. Recording an event inside that space may have been what locked it into continuity. Observation formalized. Outcome stabilized. That would explain the symbols carved beneath the paint. Not decoration, calibration. A way to keep the space aligned long enough to function. And it would explain why the room vanished once the operation concluded. Its purpose had been fulfilled. There was another thought that followed, one I resisted at first because of where it led. If that room was used to stabilize outcomes, then destroying it wasn't about secrecy. It was about preventing further anchoring, removing the node so nothing else could be logged there, which raised an uncomfortable question. Who decided when it was time to shut it down? The raid hadn't just been about eliminating a target. It had been a controlled termination of a process, one that had run its course or become unstable. I thought about the silence we felt inside the compound, the way sound seemed absorbed rather than reflected, the sense that the room was listening. What if it wasn't listening to us? What if it was listening to time? Years later, during a routine medical exam, the doctor asked an odd question. Not about sleep or stress, but about perception. Whether I experienced moments where cause and effect felt inverted. Whether I ever recognized outcomes before their triggers. I asked him why he wanted to know. He said it was part of a new intake form. I didn't believe him. I started noticing similar questions elsewhere. Insurance applications. Psychological screenings. Subtle probes designed to identify people who notice patterns too early or too accurately. Receivers. That word came back to me then, uninvited. Not in the supernatural sense, in the procedural one. People who could detect alignment shifts before they were publicly acknowledged. People who had been exposed to nodes like the room and carried some residual sensitivity afterward. I stopped volunteering for anything that required evaluation. I kept my answers neutral, boring, unremarkable. And still, every so often I would see it. A headline before it existed. A location before it mattered. A decision before it was announced. Not clearly, not usefully, just enough to know the system was still running and still being fed. I tried to live as if none of it mattered. That was the only way forward. You either let the pattern consume you, or you compartmentalize it until it becomes background noise. Most people choose the second option without realizing it's a choice. I chose it deliberately. For a while it worked. The days filled with ordinary things. Contracts. Travel. Small routines that had nothing to do with rooms that shouldn't exist, or files that recorded outcomes in advance. But the system has a way of reminding you when you've been inside it. Not through threats or warnings. Through recognition. It happened at an airport. I was waiting to board a domestic flight. Nothing sensitive, no equipment, no uniform. Just another traveler moving through a terminal designed to make people forget where they are. A man sat across from me. Mid-40s. Clean cut. No visible indicators. He glanced at me once, then again, then looked away. A few minutes later, he stood up, walked past, and said quietly, "You were present." Not a question. I didn't respond. He kept walking. That was it. No follow-up. No exchange of information. But the phrase stayed with me because it wasn't vague. He didn't say, "You were there," or "You saw something." He said, "Present," as if physical location was secondary to participation. As if the act of being in that room had registered somewhere permanent. After that, I stopped assuming anonymity was possible. Not because I thought I was being tracked constantly, but because I understood that exposure worked differently. You didn't need surveillance if alignment could be inferred. The next shift was more subtle. I began to notice delays. Not delays in events, but delays in acknowledgement. Something would happen, and the public record would lag behind it by days, sometimes weeks. Not because of classification, but because the narrative needed adjustment. Context needed time to catch up to outcome. The files in that room hadn't needed narratives. They had only dates. That told me everything I needed to know about their priority. At some point, the question stopped being, "What was that room?" and became, "How many others exist?" Or existed, or would exist when needed. I remembered the phrase from the email, observational, not spatial. That meant these spaces didn't have to be permanent. They only had to be instantiated briefly, aligned long enough to do their work, then collapsed, like temporary scaffolding around reality. And scaffolding leaves marks on the people who walk on it. I realized then that the reason so many details around the raid felt sanitized afterward wasn't just to protect sources or methods. It was to reduce exposure, to keep as few people as possible from remembering the wrong things too clearly. Memory itself became a liability. That explained the way some of the men I served with responded when I brought it up. Not denial. Absence. As if the memory had been filed somewhere inaccessible, not erased, just removed from active recall. I wondered briefly if mine would go the same way. It didn't. Some exposures stick. Years later, I saw a classified briefing slide by accident. Not the content, just the title, visible for a moment on a screen as someone minimized a window. It read, "Continuity artifacts, decommissioned, plural." That was when I understood that the room hadn't been unique or ancient or mystical. It was infrastructure. Specialized, yes. Rare, probably, but understood well enough to be catalogued, assessed, and eventually retired, which meant someone knew how to build them, and someone knew when to stop using them. The unsettling part wasn't that such knowledge existed. It was that it was being managed quietly, without urgency, without fear. As if this was simply one more layer of the world operating beyond public perception. I stopped thinking about why. Instead, I focused on what. What kind of system requires physical spaces to stabilize outcomes across time? What kind of threat requires documentation before events occur? And what kind of future assumes that intervention isn't necessary, only observation and alignment? Those questions didn't have answers that led anywhere good, so I stopped asking them, but I never stopped paying attention. There was a period when I thought the sensitivity would fade. Exposure effects usually do. The mind adapts, dulls the edges, reclassifies experiences as memory rather than signal. That's how most people survive proximity to things they aren't meant to process long term. But this wasn't like that. What changed wasn't intensity. It was selectivity. I stopped noticing everything. I started noticing only the things that mattered, though I didn't always know why they mattered at the time. A meeting that felt unnecessary but was held anyway. A facility upgrade approved without a stated threat. A program renamed without explanation, its objectives unchanged but its language softened. Those were alignment actions. Once you see them that way, they're impossible to miss. I encountered another one during a short-term advisory role overseas. A government building scheduled for renovation had an entire floor closed off, not because of structural issues, but because of acoustic inconsistencies. That was the phrase used in the request for funds. No engineer I spoke to could define it precisely. They all deferred to someone else. The floor reopened 6 months later. Different layout, same exterior. No one talked about it. I didn't ask. At some point, I accepted that my usefulness to whatever system managed these things wasn't active participation. It was passive confirmation, presence without interference. As long as I observed and didn't disrupt, I remained irrelevant. That changed the day I received a call from a number with no caller ID. The voice on the other end didn't identify itself. It didn't need to. "We're conducting a routine continuity check," the man said. "We need to confirm that you're not experiencing escalation." "Escalation of what?" I asked. There was a pause. Short. Calculated. "Perceptual overlap," he replied. I told him I was fine. He accepted that without follow-up. Before the call ended, he added one thing. "If that changes, do not document it. Contact the number you were given." I knew which number he meant. After that, I stopped pretending this was incidental. Someone had flagged me. Not as a risk, but as a variable. Something to be monitored lightly. The way you monitor a system you believe is stable, but don't fully trust. The room had left residue. Not psychological damage, calibration. I thought again about the tall shape I'd seen reflected in the window that night. I had avoided interpreting it for years. Visual stress, peripheral distortion, adrenaline, all reasonable explanations. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized the shape itself hadn't been the point. The point was that I'd seen something where nothing should have been visible at all. The reflection hadn't been wrong because of what it showed. It had been wrong because it existed. Windows reflect light. That room shouldn't have had any, which meant the room wasn't just observational. It was permeable. That idea followed me into sleep more often after that. Not nightmares, just incomplete dreams. Spaces without edges. Conversations that ended before meaning resolved. The sense that something was being checked, not communicated with. I began to suspect that whatever maintained those rooms didn't observe humans the way humans observe systems. It didn't watch actions. It watched coherence. Whether things lined up the way they were supposed to. And sometimes, when they didn't, intervention wasn't violent. It was architectural. The most unsettling realization came quietly one evening while reviewing an old notebook. I had drawn the layout of the room years earlier. I hadn't looked at it in a long time. When I did, I noticed something I was certain hadn't been there before. A correction. One of the angles I'd sketched no longer matched what I remembered drawing. It wasn't dramatic, just slightly adjusted, as if the drawing had been nudged towards something more consistent, more compliant. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the notebook and put it away. Some records are allowed to persist. Others correct themselves. After the call, I stopped trying to understand who was on the other end. Identity didn't matter anymore. The system wasn't personal. It didn't need names or faces. It only needed compliance with certain boundaries. And I had already crossed one simply by being present when I shouldn't have been. What surprised me was how ordinary everything remained. No surveillance vans, no warnings, no pressure. Life continued with the same texture it had before. That was the most convincing part. Whatever managed continuity didn't disrupt daily reality unless it had to. It preferred invisibility. Normality was camouflage. I began to suspect that escalation didn't mean exposure or danger. It meant deviation. Deviation from alignment. That realization reframed the way I looked at certain historical events. Incidents that had always been explained as intelligence failures or bureaucratic inertia. Situations where actions seemed delayed for no rational reason, as if someone had decided not to intervene despite having the means. What if intervention had already occurred earlier? Not in the way people imagine. Not through prevention. Through adjustment. I noticed something else then. Many of the dates I remembered weren't attached to disasters. They were attached to corrections, small events that nudged systems back into stability, a facility shutdown that prevented a larger failure, a political resignation that diffused a growing imbalance, a funding cut that quietly ended a program that was drifting towards something unstable. Those weren't predictions of catastrophe. They were markers of containment. The room hadn't been a warning system. It had been a ledger. That thought stayed with me longer than the rest. It explained the lack of urgency, the calm with which the materials had been confiscated, the reason no one panicked. Panic implies uncertainty. This system operated on expectation. At some point, I realized I was no longer trying to remember what happened in the room. I was trying to understand why I'd been allowed to remember at all. Others hadn't. Some had gaps where that night should have been. Others spoke about it in generic terms, stripped of texture, as if recalling a briefing rather than an experience. A few refused to talk about it entirely, not defensively, but blankly. Memory had been selectively preserved, not erased, filtered. That suggested intent. I wondered whether remembering was a liability or a function, whether people like me existed as passive sensors, validating that continuity was holding without actively participating in its maintenance. A redundant check. I stopped writing things down after that, not out of fear, but out of respect for the boundaries that had already been drawn. The more you document, the more you risk misalignment. Still, there were moments. Once, during a routine commute, I passed a building under renovation. The upper floors were sealed off with temporary walls. For a brief second, as sunlight reflected off the glass, I felt the same pressure I'd felt in that room years earlier. Not fear, compression. Like space was being asked to behave. Then it passed. 2 weeks later, the building reopened. Different interior, same exterior footprint. No one noticed. That was when I accepted something I'd been avoiding. The system wasn't reacting to human actions. Humans were reacting to adjustments made long before they understood why. The room in Abbottabad hadn't been a secret kept from the world. It had been a mechanism briefly exposed. And exposure was the anomaly. I stopped expecting answers after that. Expectation creates friction, and friction draws attention. Whatever maintained alignment didn't seem interested in curiosity. It responded to instability, not questions. What it did respond to was accumulation. Small deviations, when allowed to stack, produced tension. I could feel it in certain places. Transportation hubs that felt heavier than they should. Government buildings where conversations flattened, as if language itself was being dampened. Rooms where people unconsciously lowered their voices without knowing why. These weren't the rooms themselves. They were early symptoms. Once you recognized them, you could usually predict what came next. Temporary closures, renovations, policy shifts explained as routine optimization. The same pattern repeated with enough consistency that it stopped feeling coincidental. I began to understand why the dates in those files were spaced the way they were. Not evenly, not rhythmically. They clustered around periods of instability, economic pressure, technological inflection points, moments when systems were being pushed faster than their frameworks could adapt. The files weren't tracking human events. They were tracking stress. And stress, when left unresolved, deforms structure. That realization reframed the symbols under the paint. They weren't inscriptions. They were constraints. A way to reinforce boundaries long enough for alignment to settle. Geometry used not as language, but as regulation. I wondered how old the method was. Not the room itself, but the principle behind it. The use of space to stabilize outcomes. The idea that observation wasn't passive, but corrective. It didn't feel modern. It felt inherited. That thought made me uneasy in a way nothing else had. Modern systems fail loudly. Ancient ones fail quietly, after long periods of apparent success. I started paying attention to older structures when I traveled. Religious buildings, administrative centers, places that had been repurposed repeatedly across centuries without ever being fully abandoned. Some of them had the same acoustic qualities, the same pressure. I didn't linger. I didn't need to. The sense of being monitored returned occasionally, but it never escalated. No follow-up calls, no additional instructions. That told me something important. I wasn't a priority. The system didn't care whether I believed in it or not. Belief was irrelevant. Alignment was what mattered. There was one exception. It happened during a blackout, a regional outage, nothing dramatic. Power returned within hours. Most people treated it as an inconvenience. I was sitting in my apartment when the lights went out, watching the city fall into a grid of darkness punctuated by backup generators. In that moment, with the ambient noise gone, I felt it again. That same compression. The sense that something was checking consistency, like a hand running across fabric to find a wrinkle. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone. I waited. When the power came back, the feeling dissipated immediately, as if the test had concluded. The next morning, a local news article mentioned a delayed infrastructure upgrade that had been quietly fast-tracked overnight. No connection was suggested. No explanation offered beyond efficiency. I recognized it for what it was. Correction. At that point, the question that remained wasn't whether such systems existed. That was settled. The question was how close we were to needing more of them. The room in Abbottabad had been singular only because it had been exposed during an operation that wasn't designed around it. It had been caught mid-function. That suggested something else. Whatever was coming next wouldn't be caught that way. It would be built into the process from the beginning. Integrated. Invisible. And no one inside it would ever think to ask why. The room felt wrong. By the time I understood that, it was already too late to step outside of it. Not because of surveillance or consequence, but because once you recognize alignment mechanisms, you start participating simply by existing within them. Awareness itself becomes a form of interaction. I noticed it in language first. Certain terms began appearing more frequently across unrelated sectors. Not buzzwords, not trends, but specific phrases that carried the same structural meaning, even when applied to different problems. Resilience optimization, systemic buffering, predictive resilience. None of them described action. They described tolerance. How much deviation could be absorbed before correction became necessary? No one talked about prevention anymore, only thresholds. That was when I realized the system had stopped trying to stop outcomes. It had shifted to managing their impact. Not controlling the future, but smoothing its arrival. The room had been part of an earlier phase, a cruder one. Back then, outcomes had been logged explicitly. Dates written down, events referenced directly. It was blunt, risky. Anyone who saw the files could notice the pattern. Now it was abstracted. Models instead of dates. Adaptive frameworks instead of rooms. Distributed alignment rather than centralized nodes. More efficient, harder to detect. I wondered how many people were now involved without knowing it. Architects designing layouts that felt right, without understanding why. Policy analysts recommending delays or accelerations based on intuition, backed by opaque data. Engineers adjusting parameters because simulations suggested discomfort, not failure. No single person held the whole picture. That was the point. I thought again about the man at the airport. You were present. At the time, I'd taken it as recognition. Now I understood it as classification. Presence wasn't about location. It was about exposure to an earlier iteration of the system. People like me were remnants, legacy variables. That explained the continuity checks, the quiet monitoring. They weren't worried about what I might say. They were interested in whether I still perceived alignment the old way, whether I reacted to anomalies that newer systems no longer produced. We were calibration tools, outdated ones. The final confirmation came unexpectedly, through something mundane, a job offer I didn't apply for. Advisory role, short-term, high-level, vague responsibilities, generous compensation. I declined, not because I was afraid, but because I recognized the timing. The offer came shortly after a cluster of events that, years earlier, would have warranted a room. Now they didn't. The system had matured past that need. Declining the offer wasn't an act of resistance. It was an acknowledgement that my usefulness was diminishing. I was part of an older model that had already been superseded. No one followed up. That told me everything. The room in Abbottabad hadn't been destroyed because it was dangerous. It had been retired. Obsolete infrastructure replaced by something cleaner, quieter, and far more pervasive. The terrifying part wasn't that someone could predict the future. It was that prediction was no longer necessary. Alignment had become ambient. And once that happens, no one notices the moment when free movement becomes guided flow, when choice becomes statistical inevitability, when correction happens before dissent can even form. I still think about that room sometimes, not with fear, but with a kind of reluctant respect. It had been honest in its way, blunt, visible, a place where you could stand and know something was wrong. The newer systems don't offer that clarity. They don't feel wrong. They feel normal. I don't know when I stopped waiting for something to happen. Maybe I never really was. Waiting implies expectation. An expectation implies an event. By then, I understood there wouldn't be one, not the kind people recognize. There would be no moment of revelation, no collapse, no confirmation that justified looking back and saying this was the point where it changed. Because it already had. The system didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It didn't replace reality. It folded into it, quietly adjusting pressure where needed, relieving strain before fracture became visible. The older rooms had been obvious because they were external. They existed apart from normal space, required maintenance, required people to enter them. The newer methods didn't. They existed in process. I began to think of the room in Abbottabad the way you think of an early prototype. Functional but inelegant, too centralized, too vulnerable to discovery. It relied on containment rather than diffusion. What followed was better. I could see it in how decisions were framed. Options presented as natural progressions rather than choices. Constraints explained as inevitabilities rather than impositions. Language softened until resistance lost its shape. Nothing forced, nothing hidden, just aligned. The most unsettling part wasn't the loss of control. It was the loss of friction. Friction is how you know something is wrong. Friction tells you where to push. When everything moves smoothly, you assume it's because it should. That's how systems endure. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the men who built the first versions. The ones who carved symbols into walls, arranged stones on desks, anchored outcomes to rooms that shouldn't exist. I wonder if they understood what they were starting, or if they believed they were containing something dangerous. They probably thought they were being careful. Most people do. I still carry the memory of that room. Not because it haunts me, but because it reminds me that the world once had places where wrongness was obvious. You could walk into it and feel it immediately. The silence, the pressure, the sense that reality was being asked to hold a shape it didn't want. Those places are gone now, not because the need disappeared, but because the method improved. If there are rooms like that now, no one steps into them knowingly. They don't have walls or desks or filing cabinets. They don't need dates written down. They exist in workflows, in architectures, in feedback loops that adjust themselves before anyone thinks to ask why. And if someone notices, if someone feels that old compression, that faint sense that something is listening, they don't call it a room, they call it intuition. I don't talk about this anymore. Not because I'm afraid, but because there's nothing to warn people about. You can't point at alignment. You can't photograph it. You can't raid it in the middle of the night and walk away with evidence in a bag. All I know is that once, for 47 minutes, I stood inside something that wasn't meant to be seen. And that experience taught me what the earlier versions looked like. Everything since has taught me how much better they've become. That's all this is. Not a revelation. Not a confession. Just an account of being present before the process learned how to disappear completely.